Number 3 engine is on fire. We can't feather it.
Copy that. Maintaining speed. We're losing altitude fast.
The sky is crowded with smoke and black bursts of flak. Each explosion blooms like a violent flower, tearing at metal and air alike. German anti-aircraft batteries pound the cold sky with practiced precision, their shells timed to burst at bomber altitude. From the cockpit of a Messerschmitt interceptor, a German pilot watches through drifting clouds. Below him, American bombers stagger forward, some trailing smoke, some flying with engines dead, holes punched clean through their wings and fuselages. They should be falling. Instead, they hold formation. A B-17 limps along on 2 engines, its tail shredded, yet it stays in line. Another flies with a shattered nose, crew exposed to the freezing wind, still refusing to break away. Flak has done its work. The damage is obvious. The losses are real. And yet the formation does not collapse. The pilot tightens his grip on the control stick, unsettled not by the bomber's armor, but by their behavior. They do not scatter. They do not retreat in panic. They continue on course, as if bound together by something invisible. Only later will German airmen understand what they are seeing. It is not the strength of the aircraft that keeps them coming. It is the coordination behind them. By the winter of 1942-1943, the air war over Europe had entered a new and unforgiving phase. The United States Army Air Forces were no longer testing ideas or probing defenses. They were committing fully to a doctrine that many believed was impossible to sustain: daylight strategic bombing. British Bomber Command had already learned the cost of flying deep into German airspace, under the sun. After catastrophic losses in 1940 and 1941, the Royal Air Force shifted almost entirely to night bombing. Darkness, they concluded, was the only protection heavy bombers had against fighters and flak. The Americans disagreed. U.S. planners believed that massed formations of heavily armed bombers, flying in daylight, could defend themselves. Precision, they argued, required visibility, and discipline, they believed, could replace stealth. At the center of this belief stood aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. They were not invincible, but they were built to absorb punishment. Multiple engines, redundant systems, heavy defensive armament covering nearly every approach angle. Yet aircraft alone did not define the doctrine. What truly mattered was formation flying. American bombers were trained to fly in tight, interlocking boxes. Each aircraft protected the others. Every gun overlapped another. Breaking formation meant death, either from fighters or from isolation over enemy territory. This was not instinctive. It was drilled relentlessly. Crews trained in the United States for months, memorizing procedures, signals, and emergency protocols. Radios were central to everything they did. Commands flowed from lead aircraft down through the formation. Course corrections, altitude changes, bomb release timing, nothing was left to improvisation. Germany understood flak. By 1943, the Reich had constructed the most sophisticated anti-aircraft network in the world. The Flak Corps ringed major cities, factories, rail hubs, and oil installations with thousands of heavy 88mm guns, supported by searchlights, radar, and centralized fire control. Flak batteries were coordinated with mathematical precision. Shells were timed to explode exactly where bombers were expected to be seconds later. A direct hit was not always necessary. Shrapnel could tear through aluminum skin, sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, or kill crew members instantly. German pilots believed flak would do what fighters alone could not: break the formations. If bombers scattered, fighters would finish the job. Early results seemed to confirm this confidence. American losses climbed quickly. Missions over France were costly. Deep penetrations into Germany were worse. Aircraft failed to return. Crews were killed, captured, or vanished without trace. From the German perspective, it appeared unsustainable. No air force, many believed, could accept such attrition and continue flying the same routes. the same targets, the same daylight missions. And yet, mission after mission, the formations kept coming back. Damaged, reduced, scarred, but organized. What German air defenses had not yet fully grasped was that the Americans were not merely sending bombers into the sky. They were sending systems designed to endure loss without collapse, systems that relied less on individual survival and more on collective function. As the raids pushed deeper into the Reich, the true test was about to begin. One that would force German pilots to reconsider everything they thought they understood about breaking an enemy in the air. For the Luftwaffe, the air defense of the Reich was not merely a tactical problem. It was a matter of national survival. By 1943, German cities and industrial centers were exposed in ways few had anticipated before the war. Factories that fueled the Wehrmacht, rail hubs that moved entire armies, and oil facilities that powered tanks and aircraft all lay beneath predictable bomber routes. German planners believed they understood how to stop them. The strategy rested on attrition. Heavy flak would weaken formations before they reached their targets. Fighters would then exploit the damage, isolating stragglers and destroying bombers one by one. The goal was not necessarily to stop a single raid, but to make the cost unbearable over time. German pilots were trained to look for signs of collapse. A bomber slipping out of formation, a unit losing altitude, a formation beginning to loosen under pressure. These were moments when morale failed, when fear overrode discipline. In earlier campaigns, this logic had worked against Polish and French aircraft, against Soviet formations in the early years of the Eastern Front, even against British bombers before they moved decisively to night operations. But the American bombers behaved differently. German pilots reported something unusual after repeated interceptions. Even after suffering flak damage that would normally force an aircraft to turn back or crash, U.S. bombers often remained in formation long enough to complete the mission. Wounded aircraft did not immediately flee. Damaged planes were absorbed by neighboring elements. If a lead bomber was hit, another took its place. This resilience puzzled German airmen. They were used to enemy aircraft breaking apart psychologically before they broke physically. Panic spread faster than fire. But among American bomber crews, panic seemed systematically suppressed. One explanation lay in command structure. American bomber formations were not loose collections of aircraft. They were rigid hierarchies. Every formation had designated leads, alternates, and clearly defined responsibilities. If communication failed at one level, it continued at another. Radios made this possible. Each bomber carried multiple radio systems, allowing contact within the formation and with higher command. Orders did not depend on visual signals alone. Course changes, rally points, emergency procedures, all could be transmitted instantly. Even when flak severed antennas or damaged equipment, redundancy often kept at least one channel open. German pilots began to realize that destroying a bomber did not necessarily weaken the formation as much as expected. In some cases, it strengthened the survivors' cohesion. The remaining aircraft tightened their spacing, increasing mutual firepower. This had consequences. Fighter attacks became more dangerous. Approaching a bomber box meant flying into a dense cone of defensive fire. German pilots knew the risk. Losses mounted. Experienced airmen were killed faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, American production lines were accelerating. The United States was producing bombers at a scale Germany could not match. Aircraft losses, while severe, were being replaced faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Crews, too, were trained in numbers previously unimaginable. German intelligence recognized the imbalance, but struggled to communicate its implications upward. To many senior officers, the bombers still appeared vulnerable. Flak reports showed impressive damage. Wreckage fell across the countryside. Prisoners confirmed heavy casualties. Yet something fundamental was being misunderstood. The Americans were not measuring success by survival alone. They measured it by mission completion. A bomber that dropped its payload, even if it never returned, had fulfilled its purpose. A formation that reached its target, despite losses, was considered operationally successful. This mindset altered everything. German pilots, trained to preserve their aircraft and themselves whenever possible, found it difficult to counter an enemy willing to accept damage without abandoning the objective. By early 1943, it became clear that Flak alone would not stop the daylight offensive. The bombers were absorbing punishment, but not losing coherence. And as the Luftwaffe struggled to adapt, the Americans were learning from every mission, refining their formations, improving communication, and preparing for the moment when endurance would turn into dominance. That moment would not come all at once. It would reveal itself gradually, through patterns German pilots could no longer ignore. Patterns that pointed toward a deeper advantage, one not forged from steel or engines, but from coordination under fire. Inside an American bomber at altitude, war felt different than it did in a fighter cockpit. There was no speed to rely on, no sudden dive to escape danger, no evasive roll to shake an attacker. There was only endurance. Temperatures at 25,000 feet dropped well below freezing. Oxygen masks numbed faces. Frost formed inside the aircraft. Crew members wore electrically heated suits that often failed mid-mission, leaving hands stiff and unresponsive. Flak shook the aircraft violently, not once, but repeatedly. Each explosion sent shockwaves through thin aluminum skin. Instruments flickered. Intercom lines went dead. Hydraulic fluids sprayed into open compartments. The smell of burning insulation mixed with cordite and oil. And yet, bomber crews were trained to respond not with panic, but with procedure. Every man had a role. Every role had a checklist. If an engine was hit, the flight engineer compensated. If control cables were damaged, manual trim was adjusted. If the bombardier was wounded, the navigator took his place. There was no improvisation in the emotional sense, only practiced reaction. German pilots noticed this quickly. They expected chaos after flak hits. They expected crews to break formation once casualties mounted. Instead, they saw bombers flying with half their control surfaces gone, maintaining altitude and direction through sheer discipline. This was not bravery in the romantic sense. It was conditioning. American bomber crews were taught that survival depended less on individual action and more on remaining part of the formation. A lone bomber was vulnerable. A damaged bomber within a box was still protected, so they stayed. Even when wounded, even when freezing, even when engines burned. From above and around them, German pilots watched aircraft that should have been dead continue forward, not because they were undamaged, but because the men inside them refused to abandon the system holding them together. This psychological rigidity, this refusal to break, became one of the most unsettling aspects of facing American bombers, because it meant fear was no longer a weapon. To German airmen, the American bomber formations looked unnatural, too tight, too deliberate, too ordered to be spontaneous. What they were witnessing was geometry turned into doctrine. American bomber formations were designed not merely to deliver bombs, but to survive contact with enemy defenses. Each aircraft's position was calculated to maximize overlapping fields of fire. Gunners were trained not to track targets individually, but to fire into designated zones. A fighter entering one zone would immediately be engaged by multiple gunners from different angles. This mattered enormously. German pilots were skilled. Many were veterans of multiple fronts, but attacking a bomber box was unlike anything they had experienced before. There was no single weak point. Every approach path carried risk. Flak was supposed to loosen these formations. Instead, flak often caused the opposite effect. When a bomber was damaged, nearby aircraft tightened spacing to maintain coverage. Gaps were filled. Leadership passed seamlessly from one lead aircraft to another. Visual signals were supplemented by radio commands, ensuring alignment even when visibility was poor. German pilots began reporting formations that absorbed damage without losing cohesion. From a tactical perspective, this was alarming. Fighter doctrine depended on breaking enemy structure. Once cohesion failed, kills followed rapidly. Against American bombers, cohesion endured far longer than expected. This endurance forced German fighters to stay engaged longer, exposing them to sustained defensive fire and increasing their own casualties. The bomber box, initially mocked as slow and cumbersome, revealed itself as a moving fortress, not because of armor, but because of coordination. And coordination, unlike metal, could not be shattered with a single hit. If there was one factor German pilots consistently underestimated, it was communication. Radios were not new to warfare. The Luftwaffe used them extensively. But the Americans integrated radio communication into every layer of bomber operations with a level of redundancy and discipline unmatched at the time. Each bomber carried multiple radio systems: primary, secondary, emergency. Even when antennas were damaged, internal communication often continued. Pilots received instructions from formation leaders. Bombardiers synchronized release times. Navigators adjusted headings based on transmitted corrections. This mattered most after flak hits. In many air forces, damage meant confusion. Loss of instruments or visual cues often led to disorientation. American crews compensated through radio coordination. If one bomber lost navigation capability, another guided it. If a lead aircraft was hit, control transferred instantly. German pilots noticed that formations did not drift aimlessly after flak bursts. They adjusted. They corrected. They pressed on. What looked like stubbornness was actually structured response. Radio discipline extended beyond the formation. Ground controllers provided weather updates. Pathfinders communicated target markers. Escort fighters coordinated rendezvous points. The bomber was never truly alone. German pilots, flying high-speed interceptors, relied heavily on visual contact and brief radio exchanges. American bombers operated inside a continuous web of information. That web held, even under fire. And once German airmen recognized this, they began to understand why destruction alone was not enough. The system was designed to function while damaged. German pilots were not naive. They were professionals. Many had entered the war confident, even arrogant, based on early successes. But by 1943, confidence was giving way to something more complex: frustration. Interceptions became more dangerous. Bomber gunners improved. Formation discipline tightened. Flak inflicted damage, but did not stop missions. Pilots began returning from sorties with stories that unsettled their squadrons. Bombers flying without noses. Aircraft held together by control cables alone. Formations that continued bombing runs despite visible casualties. This was not supposed to happen. German doctrine emphasized efficiency and decisive engagement. The American approach seemed wasteful, until its results became undeniable. Pilots began to respect the enemy they once dismissed. Not admiration, but recognition. Recognition that they were facing an opponent willing to endure damage in service of an objective. Recognition that morale, once thought fragile, had been reinforced by structure. This psychological shift mattered. Air combat was not only about machines, it was about belief, and belief, once shaken, altered behavior. Some pilots hesitated longer before attacking. Others avoided deep penetration into bomber boxes. Losses increased. The balance was shifting, not because German pilots had lost skill, but because the conditions of combat had changed in ways they could not easily control. At its core, the daylight bombing campaign represented a clash of philosophies. The German defense relied on attrition: destroy enough aircraft, and the enemy would stop coming. The American offense relied on persistence: accept losses, complete missions, and return tomorrow. German pilots counted wrecks. American planners counted tonnage dropped. This difference created confusion. From the ground, German commanders saw successful flak engagements and believed progress was being made. From the air, pilots saw formations that kept returning, unchanged in purpose. The Americans were not ignoring losses. They were absorbing them. Aircraft production, crew training pipelines, and rotation policies were designed to sustain pressure over time. Individual missions were costly, but the campaign was cumulative. German pilots sensed this long before it was fully acknowledged at higher levels. They were fighting battles. The Americans were fighting systems. And systems, once proven resilient, are extraordinarily difficult to stop. By the time this realization spread, the bombers were no longer merely surviving. They were setting the stage for dominance, the stage on which the turning point of the air war would soon unfold. German pilots often described American bombers as flying wrecks that refused to fall. What they were seeing was not luck, it was design philosophy. American bombers were built around redundancy, not strength in a single component, but survivability through duplication. Control systems were doubled. Fuel lines could be isolated. Engines were spaced so that damage to one would not cripple the entire aircraft. This mattered enormously under Flak. A shell burst might destroy one system, but another often remained functional. Crews were trained to identify damage quickly and reroute power, fuel, or control authority accordingly. The aircraft degraded, but rarely failed outright. German pilots, accustomed to aircraft optimized for performance and climb, were surprised by this tolerance for damage. Fighters were not meant to be hit. Bombers were built expecting it. The realization was unsettling. It meant the Americans had accepted vulnerability at the design stage and engineered around it. Every bomber that limped home reinforced the idea that destruction required more than hits. It required total system failure. And that was far harder to achieve in the chaos of combat. Leadership inside bomber formations rarely looked dramatic from the outside. There were no heroic charges, no sudden maneuvers. Leadership was measured in calm voices over damaged radios. Formation leaders were trained to suppress emotion. Panic at the top spread instantly through dozens of aircraft. Calm, by contrast, stabilized entire formations. German pilots noticed this consistency. Even after heavy flak concentrations, bomber formations corrected course methodically. Bomb runs were not rushed. Release points were adjusted with precision. This steadiness contrasted sharply with German expectations. They assumed heavy losses would force hurried decisions. Instead, American leaders treated chaos as a variable, not a crisis. Leadership doctrine emphasized mission completion over individual survival, but it also emphasized order. Even damaged formations retained hierarchy. This combination, discipline without recklessness, proved difficult to counter. Leadership inside bomber formations rarely looked dramatic from the outside. There were no heroic charges, no sudden maneuvers. Leadership was measured in calm voices over damaged radios. Formation leaders were trained to suppress emotion. Panic at the top spread instantly through dozens of aircraft. Calm, by contrast, stabilized entire formations. German pilots noticed this consistency. Even after heavy flak concentrations, bomber formations corrected course methodically. Bomb runs were not rushed, release points were adjusted with precision. This steadiness contrasted sharply with German expectations. They assumed heavy losses would force hurried decisions. Instead, American leaders treated chaos as a variable, not a crisis. Leadership doctrine emphasized mission completion over individual survival, but it also emphasized order. Even damaged formations retained hierarchy. This combination, discipline without recklessness, proved difficult to counter. As the bombing intensified, German pilots faced an unspoken dilemma. They were defending their homeland, their cities, their families, and yet they were watching enemy crews endure punishment that would break most air forces. Some pilots later admitted the experience affected them deeply. Seeing bombers continue, despite catastrophic damage, challenged assumptions about morale and resolve. It forced German airmen to confront an enemy that did not behave as expected and could not be intimidated easily. This had psychological consequences. Repeated failure to stop formations bred fatigue. Fatigue eroded aggression. Aggression was essential to fighter success. The bombers, by refusing to break, were slowly shifting the emotional balance of the air war. By mid-1943, German pilots were no longer asking whether the bombers could be stopped, but how long they could continue. The answer was becoming clear. As long as formations remained coordinated, as long as radios functioned, As long as crews trusted procedures, the bombers would keep returning. The Americans had built an air campaign that treated damage as expected, losses as manageable, and fear as something to be controlled, not eliminated. German pilots were witnessing not isolated acts of endurance, but the outward expression of a system designed to function under pressure, and systems, once proven resilient, do not collapse suddenly. They reach a turning point. That turning point was approaching, marked not by a single raid, but by a realization spreading through the Luftwaffe. The bombers were no longer merely surviving Flak. They were overcoming it. August 1943. Deep over central Germany. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. American bombers were no longer testing defenses. They were striking at the heart of the Reich ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, rail hubs, targets the German economy could not afford to lose. The raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt marked a decisive escalation. For German pilots scrambling to intercept, the sky looked familiar. Long streams of heavy bombers, contrails cutting across the morning air, Flak already rising to meet them. What followed, however, challenged everything the Luftwaffe believed about breaking an enemy in the air. Flak concentrations were heavier than ever. Guns fired in layered belts, timed precisely by radar. Black bursts filled the bomber corridors. Aircraft were hit almost immediately. German pilots saw fortresses lose engines, catch fire, drop altitude. They saw formations torn open, bombers falling away, gaps forming where aircraft had been moments before. This was the moment German commanders had been waiting for. And yet, something unexpected happened. The formations did not disintegrate. Surviving aircraft shifted positions. Alternate leads took control. Bombers closed ranks again, reforming into new boxes while still under fire. From cockpit reports, German pilots described scenes that defied previous experience. Bombers flying with structural damage so severe it should have made controlled flight impossible. One pilot noted aircraft continuing straight and level, with entire sections missing. Another described a fortress completing its bomb run, with 2 engines destroyed and its tail nearly severed. Losses were heavy on both sides. American bombers were shot down in significant numbers. Crews were killed or captured. The sky was littered with wreckage. But the bombing continued. Bombs were released on target. Industrial facilities were hit. And despite catastrophic damage, dozens of aircraft turned west, beginning the long flight home. This endurance had consequences. German pilots found themselves forced into repeated attacks against formations that refused to collapse. Each pass through defensive fire increased their own losses. Fuel ran low. Ammunition was expended. Fatigue set in. What was meant to be a decisive interception turned into a grinding test of limits. And for the first time, German airmen began to understand that Flak, even at its most concentrated, was no longer enough. The Americans had crossed an invisible threshold. They had proven that even under the worst conditions, their bomber system could function, could strike, and could return. That realization spread quickly through Luftwaffe units, and it marked the moment when shock turned into something deeper. As the damaged American bombers turned west, German pilots expected the final phase to be familiar. Traditionally, this was where the attrition showed. Stragglers would fall behind. Formations would fragment. Survivors would scatter in ones and twos. Instead, they saw discipline. Aircraft with wounded crews maintained formation speed. Bombers incapable of holding altitude were escorted by others flying slower than standard crews. Gunners in crippled planes continued firing until ammunition ran dry. German after-action reports from late 1943 repeatedly mention the same observation. The enemy continues flight despite damage previously considered decisive. This was not bravado. It was structure. American bomber doctrine had been built around the assumption of losses. Crews were trained not to break formation, not to chase survival individually, but to preserve the integrity of the group for as long as possible. Leadership was deliberately redundant. If a lead aircraft fell, another took over immediately. Navigation charts, Timing schedules and bombing calculations were distributed across multiple crews. German pilots attacking these formations were no longer fighting individual aircraft. They were fighting a system. Flak, once the great equalizer, began to show its limitations. It could damage, it could kill, but it could not stop a formation already committed to its run. Even heavily damaged bombers often stayed stable long enough to release their payloads. This created a strategic problem the Luftwaffe had not prepared for. German interceptor tactics were designed around the assumption that sufficient losses would force a raid to abort. But American bombers were no longer aborting. Even missions that lost a quarter of their aircraft still struck targets. This shocked German planners, more than the losses themselves. The expectation that fear, attrition, or mechanical damage would halt raids proved false. The Americans accepted losses as part of the calculation. Replacement crews and aircraft arrived continuously. Production outpaced destruction. By late 1943, German pilots began reporting a new frustration. Even successful interceptions failed to change outcomes. Bombing accuracy improved. Target selection became more deliberate. Escort fighters began appearing deeper into German airspace. The skies were no longer contested in brief clashes. They were being occupied. During the winter of 1943-44, the pattern solidified. American bombers returned again and again through flak belts that had already reached maximum density. Gun crews fired until barrels overheated. Ammunition expenditure soared. Yet the formations kept coming. German pilots no longer spoke of stopping the bombers. They spoke of surviving the interceptions. The shock was not that American bombers were brave. It was that they were predictably relentless. No single loss changed the plan. No single defense stopped the flow. The system absorbed punishment and continued. By the time long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang fully entered the fight, the realization was already complete. The bomber offensive could no longer be broken from the air alone. The turning point had passed quietly, without ceremony. Not with one battle, not with one decision, but with the acceptance that endurance itself had become a weapon. And once that truth set in, the balance of the air war over Europe was already shifting, irreversibly, toward the Americans. By early 1944, the effects of the American bomber offensive were no longer theoretical. They were measurable. German industrial output had not collapsed, but it was bending under sustained pressure. Ball bearing production, aircraft assembly, synthetic fuel processing, and rail infrastructure were being hit repeatedly, sometimes rebuilt, then struck again. The damage was cumulative, not decisive in a single blow, but corrosive over time. What mattered more was how the Luftwaffe was being forced to respond. German fighter units were now tied almost permanently to homeland defense. Pilots who might have reinforced the Eastern Front or Mediterranean were instead scrambling daily to intercept bomber streams. Aircraft were burned out by constant operations. Experienced crews were lost at a rate that training programs could no longer replace. This attrition was not dramatic in isolation. It was relentless. Every American raid forced German fighters into combat under unfavorable conditions, climbing to altitude, attacking well-defended formations, then disengaging low on fuel and ammunition. Each engagement eroded pilot experience, aircraft availability, and morale. German records from this period show a growing imbalance. While American bomber losses were severe, they were replaceable. German fighter losses were not. Production could not keep pace. Training hours declined. Fuel shortages worsened. By spring, German pilots were entering combat with fewer flight hours than their adversaries. Some were rushed to operational units with minimal combat preparation. The qualitative edge that had once defined the Luftwaffe began to fade. Meanwhile, American doctrine adapted again. Loss analyses were brutally honest. Bomber formations were refined. Defensive gun coordination improved. Routes were adjusted to avoid known flak concentrations when possible. Navigation precision increased. Most importantly, escort coverage expanded. With the introduction of long-range fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang. American bombers were no longer isolated once they crossed into Germany. Escorts did not merely accompany bombers, they hunted German interceptors aggressively, disrupting attack formations before they could organize. This fundamentally altered the dynamic German pilots had relied upon, where once they attacked relatively unopposed, they now faced fighters at every phase of the mission: assembly, approach, engagement, and withdrawal. The psychological impact was immediate. German pilots reported feeling hunted rather than defensive. Instead of choosing the moment of attack, they were reacting to American movements. Engagements became chaotic, costly, and increasingly one-sided. For bomber crews, the experience remained harrowing. Losses did not disappear. Missions were still dangerous. Aircraft still failed to return. But the strategic outcome had shifted. Raids no longer felt temporary. Damage no longer felt repairable. The Americans were no longer probing. They were imposing a rhythm the Germans could not escape. This realization did not arrive as a formal announcement. It emerged through reports, casualty lists, and shrinking options. Commanders began acknowledging privately that air superiority was slipping away. The bomber offensive had not broken Germany in one strike, but it had changed the terms of the war. And once those terms changed, there was no realistic path back. The consequences of that shift on German strategy, morale, and the final year of the war were about to become impossible to ignore. By mid-1944, the German air defense system was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to endure. The cumulative strain of constant interception had hollowed out the Luftwaffe. Veteran pilots were gone, killed, wounded, or captured. Their replacements arrived with limited training, fewer flight hours, and diminishing confidence. The once elite fighter arm was now an attritional force, reacting rather than shaping the battle. Fuel shortages made the situation worse. High-octane aviation fuel had become scarce. Training flights were curtailed. Operational sorties were rationed. Pilots increasingly entered combat without adequate preparation, knowing that mistakes could not be corrected in rehearsal. American commanders understood this imbalance and exploited it deliberately. Bomber streams were scheduled to force repeated scrambles. Diversionary raids triggered false alarms, wearing down defenders before main attacks even arrived. The goal was no longer only to destroy factories, it was to drain the Luftwaffe itself. And it worked. German after-action reports from late 1944 reveal a shift in language. Confidence gave way to resignation. Pilots described overwhelming escort coverage, constant pressure, and an inability to assemble effective interception formations. Some noted that simply reaching altitude before engagement had become nearly impossible. Meanwhile, American losses, though still significant, were absorbed. Aircraft production surged. Replacement crews arrived continuously. Bombers damaged beyond repair were counted, analyzed, and replaced within weeks. Training pipelines expanded rather than contracted. The bomber force did not become invulnerable. It became sustainable. This distinction mattered because sustainability allowed pressure to continue without pause. By the time Allied ground forces landed in Normandy, German air power was already compromised. Fighters that might have opposed the invasion were instead tied down, defending industrial targets far inland. Radar networks were degraded. Command structures were overstretched. The sky over Western Europe no longer belonged exclusively to the Luftwaffe. This shift had profound psychological effects. For German pilots, the realization that bomber streams would return, no matter how many were lost, undermined belief in eventual victory. The air war was no longer a contest of skill or courage. It had become a matter of endurance, and the imbalance was unmistakable. For American crews, survival remained uncertain, but purpose was clear. Each mission contributed to a cumulative effect greater than any single raid. Even aircraft that failed to return were part of a strategy that was working. By early 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German air defense system had been worn down beyond recovery. Aircraft production struggled under bombardment. Pilot quality declined sharply. Fuel shortages crippled remaining operations. The bombers kept coming, and the Germans could no longer stop them. What began as disbelief, shock that damaged aircraft could still return, ended as a strategic reality. The United States and its allies had achieved air superiority, not through perfection, but through persistence. The skies had been contested. They were now controlled. And with that control came the final phase of the war in Europe. All that remained was to understand what this endurance truly meant. For warfare, for technology, and for the people inside those aircraft. Above the shattered landscapes of Europe, the bombers continued to hum, their silhouettes etched against pale skies. Each aircraft carried more than bombs. It carried experience, coordination, and an unyielding resolve. The Germans had underestimated one thing: the persistence of a system built not only on machinery but on people, training, and industrial capacity. The shock felt by German pilots, the disbelief that heavily damaged bombers could still return, was a lesson in endurance. It was a lesson that raw skill, courage, and technical superiority alone could not dictate outcomes in modern war. The war had shifted from isolated duels in the sky to a network of interdependent actions, where each mission, each crew, each damaged aircraft contributed to a broader strategic effect. For the men inside the bombers, the risk was real. Losses were counted in hundreds of lives, yet they pressed forward, guided by radios, maps, and discipline. Their fear was tempered by purpose. Each return, each successful mission, reinforced the invisible threads connecting pilots, navigators, gunners, and ground control. An orchestration of coordination that German pilots could neither anticipate nor match. Historically, the endurance of the U.S. bomber force reshaped air warfare. It demonstrated the decisive power of systems over singular heroics, of coordination over raw strength, of industrial depth over individual brilliance. Victory, in this context, was cumulative. It was not measured by a single perfect sortie, but by the relentless, repeated presence of the bombers themselves, carrying the weight of strategy across every mile of contested airspace. Ultimately, the story of these raids is not only about machines or tactics, but about human perseverance and the invisible networks that make coordinated effort overwhelming. The Americans' ability to endure, adapt, and sustain pressure transformed the skies of Europe into a domain they controlled, turning disbelief into inevitability and shock into triumph. The skies had become a testament. Victory favored not the strongest aircraft, nor the most daring pilot, but the side that could persist, communicate, and act as one. In the end, endurance became the weapon, and coordination became the strategy that would define modern air warfare.